I thought by the time I got up here that I'd have grown some hair. That disposition we had. A couple of things I do want to mention to you. Brian was talking about the various tours you've taken. Let me offer an official invitation to the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State. Love to have you come. What we could even do, we could run an entire program for you that a day's symposium if you would like. So get after him. Jack was talking about public pressure on Davis, a little pressure on him, and get him to Mississippi State. And that comment, I must say, the one comment that Brian made that really got my attention was when he talked about the Bulldogs. My goodness, and saying somehow Mississippi State shouldn't be the Bulldogs. Well, I want you to know that even though Mississippi State was not founded until 1878, the fact of the matter, it was fated. It was fated that Mississippi State would be where it is, and it would be fated that the Grant Presidential Library would be at Mississippi State. And some of you know what I'm talking about. If you didn't get a chance, get a free bookmark that we put together. And on that bookmark, there's a quote from Abraham Lincoln to Ulysses S. Grant during the Virginia campaign, in which he says, quote, "Hold on with a bulldog grip." What can we say? What can we say? It's a thrill to be here. What a wonderful facility you have here and the university. I never realized what the age was, but I know because I've known about Kennesaw State when it was a community college. It's amazing what has been achieved here. So congratulations to all of you, and you've been doing it despite having Brian steel wheels on, which is even more amazing. But let me talk a little bit about both Grant and Sherman. You know, among the young and not so young people, young men who entered the two competing armies in 1861, there were two individuals who would become household names during that four-year war and have been remembered ever since. Hardly anyone heard of Ulysses S. Grant or William Tecumseh Sherman before the 1860s. In fact, one could almost say, and I can hear in the back of my mind a particular individual saying this, that they were both losers when before the war began. Why? Well, if you look at their careers, from the time they graduated from West Point, Grant in 1843, Sherman in 1840, and the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, there's not much that can be said there. Yes, it's true that Grant was considered a hero of the Civil War, some of the things that he did during that time, whereas Sherman was in the backwater of the war, the Mexican-American War, serving in California. Grant, as we know, resigned his commission in 1854. Sherman already resigned his commission in 1853. And they took on civilian tasks of various sorts, various jobs. When the war came, when the Civil War came, Grant wanted to enter the Army again. But nobody seemed willing to give him a position until Richard Yates, the governor of the state of Illinois, named him commander of the obstreperous 21st Illinois Volunteer Regiment. And the only reason he gave it to Grant was because nobody else wanted to command that unit. They were such a bunch of losers. So Grant takes over, instills discipline, and makes them a valuable fighting regiment. Sherman, on the other hand, doesn't want to enter the Civil War. He's living in Louisiana. He's head of the Louisiana Military Seminary, which today, as you may know, is Louisiana State University. So I used to tell our students, you know, they may beat us in football, not anymore, but they may beat us in football, but who was their first president? Just lay that out to them. William Tecumseh, Sherman. Okay. Well, Sherman did not want to enter the war because he believed that he'd be dragged down again. He didn't think the Union, the United States, the North, was taking the Confederacy seriously enough. So he refused to join up. Yet he did, of course. And the war began. The war went on for 4 years. It ended in 1865. And by that time, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were two of the military architects of the victory that preserved the Union and resulted in the freeing of the slaves. Here are two men who'd risen, literally, from the bottom rungs of society. I mean, they didn't do anything they attempted to do in the 1850s, they failed. So here are two men come from the bottom rungs of American society, and they end up being its leaders. Now, if people had been asked, you know, we'd taken a poll of a speech at Kennesaw State University in 1861, which would have been a good trick. But if people had been asked to evaluate Grant and Sherman in 1861, that evaluation would hardly be the evaluation that people would make in 1865 and since that time. Now keep in mind, Grant and Sherman really didn't know each other. They did vaguely at West Point, but not really. They first came together when Sherman, though having seniority over Grant, remember he graduated a year earlier, accepted orders from Grant, said, Grant, I will obey your orders even though I'm your superior in seniority. And this was during the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson campaign. And Sherman sent supplies to Grant, and with each boatload of supplies, he'd send a little note of encouragement to Grant. Go for it, Grant. You know, you're doing the right thing. I'm backing you all the way. Things like that. But they still really hadn't met each other. It's not until Shiloh. It's not until the Battle of Shiloh in 1862 that the two men were able to really see each other, and most importantly, I think, to see each other in action. Well, at Shiloh, what Grant saw in Sherman as he hobbled around the battlefield, remember he'd hurt his leg a little bit earlier, but Grant saw Sherman working to stem the Confederate attack of the first day, and doing so heroically. Well, that evening, in a terrible outpouring of rain, a heavy downpour, Sherman came to realize how special Grant was. Sherman was a division commander in Grant's Army of the Tennessee. And he rushed to see Grant that evening, that horrible, horrible first day for the Union forces. And he goes there expecting to get orders how to retreat, how they were going to retreat after this horrible battle. Nothing else was in Sherman's mind at that particular time. But when he ran into Grant, pardon me, in the middle of this heavy rainstorm, something told him, just looking at Grant. And Grant's not an impressive looking guy, but just looking at him, something tells him, don't bring up retreat. Don't say anything about retreat. So instead, Sherman blurts out, quote, well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we? Not knowing what he's going to get in return. And Grant made what could almost be called immortal words, quote, lick 'em tomorrow, though. No idea of retreat, and that's the way it was. Instead of retreating, Grant put the Union Army in movement on the second day, and the Federals swept the Confederates off the battlefield toward Corinth. From this point on, I think, braced by Sherman's heroics at Shiloh, Grant's refusal to retreat from there, the two men became fast friends. Big deal, you might think. Well, that was not a minor matter. The friendship between these two men, Grant and Sherman, indeed, I think you could argue, the absolute trust that they developed for one another proved crucial to the way the war was going to end up. Now, there are countless examples during the war where this unbending trust between the two men allowed them to cooperate with one another and resulting in a success against the Confederates. Now keep in mind, if you look at many Civil War generals, Union and Confederate, they didn't get along at all. Sherman and Grant got along famously. They came to trust each other. They came to believe they didn't have to look over their shoulder looking for the other guy to be trying to knife them. Well, during the Corinth campaign, after Shiloh, Halleck, Henry W. Halleck, had basically fired Grant. He didn't really. He made him second in command. But he made him second in command of the entire 100,000 three-army force, but he just ignored Grant. Totally ignored him, to the point that Grant really became depressed. He really began to wonder, did he really have a place here? I mean, Halleck was the great name, the great general, the great author of the Civil War, and he thought that Grant was a sloppy general. To the point that he wrote him letters saying, you don't send me the proper letters. You don't even fold them properly when you send them to me. That's what he meant by being sloppy. So Halleck then, ignores, bypasses Grant to the point that Grant becomes so upset that he's going to quit the war. Sherman hears about this, and he rushes to Grant's camp. And he finds Grant tying together letters and just literally preparing to leave. He tells Grant, don't leave, Grant. And he says something that, again, is fascinating. Sherman says to Grant, they called me insane. They're calling you a drunk and a sloppy general. Don't worry about it. You'll come back like I've come back. And Grant listened and said, okay, Sherman, I'll think about it. Sherman said, don't leave unless you let me know. Well, Grant decides to stay. And the friendship that had been developing at Shiloh becomes rock hard. It was this advice, this acceptance of this advice, that kept Grant in the Army, and it allowed the Army then to accomplish great things later on. Then go to the Vicksburg campaign. During the Vicksburg campaign, you remember Sherman suffers a stunning defeat at Chickasaw Bayou in December of 1862. And one of the reasons, not the main reason maybe, but certainly one of the reasons, was the fact that Grant did not show up to take part in this attack the way he was supposed to. And the reason he didn't come was because his supplies were destroyed at the town in Mississippi that I forgot. Holly Springs. But in any case, what could have happened there, and what would have happened with most generals, like Sherman taking this terrible defeat, most generals would have said something like, well, it wasn't my fault, it was that Grant. He was supposed to be here, he didn't show up. Well, what actually happened was Sherman does not blame Grant. And significantly, Grant doesn't blame Sherman for taking this terrible loss. So the two men facing this issue come together, actually come closer together than was the case before. Well, maybe most significant of all, after Sherman had captured Atlanta, I think you've all heard of that town, I think. in September of 1864. And you remember John Bell Hood's army, Confederate army, is driven off. And I'm not going to get into that because you probably know more about it than I do. But you remember that it was Sherman who then said to Grant and to Lincoln, look, I've got this idea. I do not want to continue killing my friends, the Southerners. After all, Sherman had spent most of his life in the South before the war, too. He said, I don't want to do this. I want to go into a different kind of war, a destructive war, a psychological war, to convince the Confederates they cannot win. Well, Grant and Lincoln both opposed that idea, opposed the idea of destructive war, believing that it was more important for Sherman to destroy Hood's army first before he did anything else. Well, Sherman kept insisting, I think it was a psychological need that he had, that he did not want to continue participating in the bloody mayhem of traditional Civil War battles and killing people that he knew, cadets he had known in Louisiana, friends he had known in South Carolina and other places. So he wanted to use destructive war, psychological war. So he kept insisting on that. Grant kept saying, no, I don't think so, Sherman. But then he finally agreed. He finally agreed. And then once Grant agreed, then Lincoln agreed. Later on, Grant explained his change of heart. He told Sherman and he told Lincoln later on that there was no other general other than Sherman that he, Grant, would have entrusted with such a mission. Grant had this much confidence in Sherman, in the man who had become his confidant after all, that he was willing to allow Sherman to wage a new kind of warfare, destructive psychological warfare, even though Grant himself wasn't sure it was the right thing to do. But he trusted Sherman enough in order to do that. Well, in the end, Grant proved correct in his assessment of Sherman. Sherman was right in his perceptions of Grant. They realized they could both trust each other completely, and thus they were able to do things, undertake military action, that would have been impossible without such a relationship. And we know the final result was victory. And I argue, and I believe, that one of the major reasons why the Union military was successful was because of this relationship, this strong relationship between the top two military generals on the Union side. Well, having said all that, what kind of legacy did Grant and Sherman leave the American military, American society generally, as a result of their activity, as a result of their relationship during the war? And I'm going to run through a number of these, and there's a lot more that we could mention, but I think these may be the most significant. Number one, I think during the war, the two men learned about the importance of mutual trust and support. And they passed that idea on. Now, they're two totally different people. Sherman is about 6 foot tall. Grant is about 5'6". They don't look anything alike. Yet they come to merge because their different personalities seem to merge. And what was important, I think, about the relationship was that they emphasized to themselves the best in the other guy. You know, it was very easy, it's always very easy for any of us to know weaknesses. You know somebody well enough, you know their weaknesses. And you can concentrate on that. And others might have concentrated on the weaknesses in Sherman and the weaknesses in Grant. But Grant and Sherman seemed to only see the strengths that each other had. They trusted each other completely, and they waged the war together toward a victory. And I think what they did, they demonstrated just how important that kind of relationship is if you're going to have any kind of military success. Another point I think can be made. Both men were strong believers in themselves. We hear all the stories, well, Sherman wasn't sure about this, Grant wasn't sure about that, but deep down, they're pretty confident about themselves. And yet, they're able and they're free in their praise of one another. For example, Sherman openly told anyone who would listen, including some major figures, that Grant deserved all the credit for the Vicksburg victory. In fact, Sherman had opposed it. He wrote a letter to Grant saying, I oppose your Vicksburg idea. What did Grant do with that letter? He stuck it in his pocket, never took it out. Nobody would have ever known about it except for Sherman telling anybody who would listen, I sent him a letter. I thought his plan was terrible. He's right. I was wrong. How often can you say that happening? Or remember that happening during the Civil War? Then take Grant. When Grant was promoted because of his successes in the war, you know what he did? He shifted the praise to Sherman and to General McPherson. So what you have happening is both Grant and Sherman demonstrated that you don't have to selfishly build yourself up. You can give credit to the other guy. And such generosity only means that you get closer to that individual. And when that individual is also a leading military leader in your military effort, this is amazing. This is absolutely essential. What you have happening again, as I've said before, that this necessary bond that assured victory in the future was built as the war went on. Third point, both men left behind a legacy of determination. Like most individuals, most of us want to be personally successful. That's just human nature after all. But they learned very quickly in their lives that such success could only be accomplished through a purposeful, determined effort. Remember, we talked about the fact that both Grant and Sherman were not successful early in their lives, not at all. So, in fact, they suffered through a lot of different failures. And so what they could have done, and some of us would do, I suppose, would be to quit. Given up and said, I'm a loser, I can't do this. But they don't. Instead, both men push through their failures and their disappointments, and they show determination to make something significant of themselves. Fourth point, I think, both men demonstrated that it was not enough to be simply determined. We can all want to do something, but if we don't have the native intelligence or the native ability to deal with the problem we're facing, it's going to be a difficult task for us. Grant and Sherman had the common sense, I think, the intellectual acumen, perhaps, to look at all aspects of everything that they approached, and then decide on the best way to do it. They had to also realize that they had to be flexible, to be pragmatic, to be willing to change, that this is an essential response to any problems that you might face. And you have to be willing to change, even though you're determined you're going to win, you know in your heart of hearts, here's the way to do it, but it doesn't work. So you can do one of two things. You can continue doing what you've been doing, and continue failing, or you can try something else. Grant's response to Vicksburg, I think, is a good example of this approach. You know, he had a conundrum at Vicksburg. He tried all sorts of things to get to the position to get to dry land, basically, so he could attack this Gibraltar on the Mississippi River. He tried a number of approaches. One by one, these failed. He tried still another one until he finally found the one that worked. And Sherman, I think, was intelligent enough to realize that he had a guy here that he was working for named Grant who seemed to know how to deal with issues. And Sherman was smart enough to know that he had to cooperate with Grant, even though he wasn't convinced in his heart of hearts that Grant's ideas made the most sense, as at Vicksburg, for example. But the point is that he did, and again, this friendship allowed this to happen. Fifth point, I think, both men left a legacy of moral and physical courage throughout the war. You know, the Shiloh battle, as many of you know, Sherman repeatedly exposed himself, in fact was shot a couple times in the hand. Now again, they were not major injuries by any stretch of imagination, but he put himself in a situation where he could very well have been killed. He continued pressing forward anyway. Chattanooga. At Chattanooga, he put himself, exposed himself so much that some of his men had to yell at him to get down or face injury. You know, we're familiar with the famous lead to the rear idea. Well, had a similar thing happen with Sherman and his men. And you remember the more famous one, Lincoln, get down, you damn fool. Somebody yelled at Lincoln when he was watching one of the battles going on outside Washington. And that man later became the Supreme Court Justice. So, I don't know what to tell you, but anyway, at Chattanooga, he exposed himself to all kinds of firepower, and his men had to tell him to get down. Well, Sherman was also courageous enough to try different things. For example, the march to the sea. This took a great deal of courage because Sherman knew this was going to be controversial. He knew what was going to happen, what this would mean for him, but he also understood that he had to do this or he had to continue killing people that he considered friends. So he made this particular decision. Now, Grant himself did not encounter danger on the battlefield. He was not the sort of guy that would go up and ride to the front of the battlefield. But he displayed courage throughout this war. Again, and it was more moral courage rather than physical courage. For example, the most famous example, what I've given you already, he got creamed. His army got creamed on the first day at Shiloh. Yet he had the courage to attack on the second day and pull victory out of the jaws of apparently certain defeat. You know, students, when you teach a class, and Brian can tell you this and others who teach, love what ifs. Well, what if Stonewall Jackson had only been alive? And what if this happened? What if that? Here's a good what if. What if Grant had ordered this attack on the second day and got creamed again? Would we have ever heard of Grant again? Yeah, as a total loser. but it had the courage to try it, and they had the determination, the common sense, the intelligence to put it through. The most important legacy, I guess you can call it, Grant and Sherman left the nation, I think, was their strategic vision of the war. Grant realized that the Civil War was not simply Virginia, that it was nationwide. You know, the call for the capture of Richmond, as if somehow if Richmond is captured, the war is suddenly going to end. Not going to happen that way. Grant and Sherman, and Grant particularly, but Sherman too, realized that the Civil War was not simply Virginia, but it was the entire nation. They realized that warfare was no longer Jominian. It was no longer to be fought the way Antoine-Henri Jomini, the Swiss thinker who fought with Napoleon and then in Russia. Remember, wrote these books, and all the leaders read Jomini. It was said by one later scholar that Civil War generals went into battle with a sword in one hand and Jomini's book in the other hand. Well, what Grant came to realize, and Sherman came to realize, that it was not simply to follow Jomini, that is, to maneuver masses of your troops against fractions of the enemy to capture a particularly important geographic location, like a capital, like Richmond, or like a river, or like a mountain, or whatever it might be. Grant and Sherman came to understand that in order to win the war, Grant believed you had to fight everywhere at the same time. You didn't mass your troops against fractions of the enemy in one place and not do this. Grant came to see that in order to win this war, you had to attack simultaneously all along the line. And the line is the entire country. So you don't just put pressure on the enemy, particularly when you have a larger army. You don't simply put pressure on the enemy in one place, you put pressure on the enemy everywhere. Everywhere. Well, Grant, Grant realized that the most important thing, and this is what Lincoln believed too, the most important thing you could do in this new kind of warfare was to destroy the enemy army. You capture a place. Halleck, for example, was very happy to capture Corinth, a very important geographic location, you know, 2 railroads crossing and all the rest. Very happy about that, but what happened? Beauregard and the Confederate Army disappeared to fight again. Grant realized that what you had to do was destroy the enemy army, and then everything else will fall into place. Joan Waugh, some of you know, has written a wonderful book on Grant, is writing a new book, or working on a new book, about Grant and unconditional surrender. Grant not only won major victories, but he also captured armies. You know, it was important to take Fort Donelson, but he also took the army. It was important to take Vicksburg, but he also took an army. It was important to destroy Lee's army, but it was also important to get it to surrender. How many generals can make that kind of argument? It's very interesting. Here's to see what she's going to come up with as she studies this. So you have that kind of a situation. You have to somehow get rid of that army that is fighting you. Sherman, on the other hand, came to understand, again, that the old Jominian tactics aren't going to work. They're not working. They've got to be changed. He believed that to win the war and to avoid the horrendous fatalities in combat And keep in mind another horrendous casualty causer, disease. The longer the war goes on, the more often, the more soldiers and civilians and others will die from some disease. You think about measles. We didn't think about measles for a long time, except maybe my friend John Segerson there, who worked for the health group here in Atlanta. But when you think about it, to die from measles is not a fun way to die. And a lot of soldiers died because they'd never been exposed to it until they came together in camp. Dysentery is not a wonderful way to die. And people are dying from dysentery. So, to end the war as quickly as possible through destruction of the army, through destructive war, psychological war, is not such a bad thing. How many lives are saved from disease that would happen if the war continued? And you continued the Jominian way of fighting. Southerners, Sherman believed, Southerners had to be shown that they had no hope of survival, let alone no hope of victory. So they must quit the war. They must quit the war. So the military insights that Grant and Sherman put into practice, physical destruction of the Confederate armies, psychological destruction of the Confederate Army and society, when combined together, and I think this is an important point, the friendship they had allowed them to do their own thing, but the two of them doing their own thing, coming together, resulted in the Union victory. I think it's fair to say that the legacy of Grant and Sherman, like their friendship, is very complicated. It was very complicated, but it showed the nation and the world, their activity showed the nation and the world important lessons for winning wars. In this case, for preserving the Union and ending slavery. Grant and Sherman were individually impressive individuals. Individually, they helped move the nation toward victory. Together, however, they proved unstoppable. And they left a legacy that would influence American warfare from that point to the very present day. Thank you very much.